So welcome everyone. I see some folks starting to roll in. We are so happy that you are able to join us here this evening. So whether you're watching us live or whether you're watching this recorded later on, we're just so glad that you're here and you're able to experience this session this evening. For those of you who are here live and in person, if you're able to open up your chat box, make sure you click to everyone so that way we can all see it. But maybe just pop in, where you're joining us from. If you're from New Jersey, outside of New Jersey, always curious to see where folks are rolling in from. So if you're from an organization, a school, hi and welcome. So all of our friends near and far, I am Evelyn Moon. I am the Director of Education here at Good Grief. I'm coming to you from our center in Princeton, New Jersey, and I work with all things Good Grief schools at our organization, which includes our community webinar series. So they run every month, September through June. They're offered at no cost to our Good Grief community. It's just one more way that we want to bring really great content and good work outside of the walls of our centers. I see some people chiming in. Hi, Sue. Yes, Sue is an employee here at the Princeton Center as well. So Good Grief's mission, for those of you who are new to Good Grief, we are a nonprofit organization. We've been around in New Jersey since 2004, and our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. And just a few logistics. As you saw, Sue utilized the chat function. I hope to see more of that as we continue. The session will run for about 1 hour, and I will send out certificates of attendance to those of you who are attending live. I say within 48 hours, but I'll get it to you tomorrow, so on Friday. And then this session will be uploaded onto the Good Grief YouTube channel. And now, without any further ado, I want to introduce our guest today, who is going to do our wonderful session. So Litsa Williams is a clinical social worker and co-founder of What's Your Grief. It is one of the country's largest online grief and bereavement support communities, and they've been providing support to millions of people who have been grieving and professionals that are looking for continuing education around grief and loss. So thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll hand it over to you. I'll continue to man the chat and support you in whatever ways I can.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Okay. So I definitely want to encourage people throughout this to use the chat. I'll check in periodically just with some questions or get people's thoughts and input about things. But, a lot of this, I think, when we talk about the idea of using something like continuing bonds at any different time of the year, but certainly specifically at the holidays, this is a concept that I think a lot of people, even if you've never heard the term continuing bonds before, if you've never heard of continuing bonds theory, it's something that often intuitively people realize they have already been doing, either personally, professionally, as a volunteer, in different ways. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the foundation for it, why it's important, how it can be helpful, and some ideas for it. I imagine that many of you have just as many thoughts about it as I do. So please feel free to use the chat in order to support that. So with this, I think one of the things when we talked about the what topic to present on, one of the things about continuing bonds is it is a grief theory that is truly a really research and evidence-based approach to how we think about grief and bereavement. But it is something that just, I think, especially around this time of year, becomes especially relevant or helpful to think about. And this is a time of year where no matter, I think, what your background is, what faith tradition you have or anything else, it is almost impossible to escape the holiday season and all of the winter holidays that seem to span longer and longer every year. They seem to start way before Halloween now and go well into January. And it brings up a lot for people. And though continuing bonds is something that is relevant and really helpful, I think, with grief at any time, it is something that this time of year, I think, can be especially helpful. This isn't a workshop where we're going to dig into coping with grief at the holidays in a lot of the logistical ways that come up. I did send to Evelyn a resource with some links and information about that just has a lot of articles about general holiday grief, thinking about all sorts of the things that can come up around holiday grief. So we're not going to get into all of the nuts and bolts that we could about things like that. But I do think before we get into continuing bonds that it is helpful to just kind of reflect on what it means to cope with grief at the holidays. What are some of the challenges, and what does it mean to kind of cope with some of those challenges? So I'm curious if people have any thoughts. Please feel free to jump in if you think about from your experience, or any thoughts about what that might look like at the holidays. Why is it hard? What are we trying to do when we talk about coping at the holidays? And if anyone wants to share, please continue to type, and I'm going to put a couple thoughts up on the next slide. So there's not any one reason, there's not any single thing that makes the holidays difficult. I think one of the things that's tough when we talk about the holiday season and when we talk about coping is that what is wonderful and comforting to one person is the very thing that's making the holidays so hard for another person. And there's so many different things that are coming up for people. And so part of it is asking ourselves, what is it about this time of year that feels especially hard for me? What's maybe especially hard for people who I'm teaching, people who I'm working with, people in my center, people in my family, my friends, and knowing that there are a lot of similar things, but also different things that are coming up for different people. But I think some of the things that we hear most commonly from folks are just that feeling of the holidays will never be the same again. You know, we have lost someone that our life has changed completely. And it just seems hard to imagine ever celebrating a holiday in the same way or celebrating it without that person. We may feel like the holiday is just bringing up these really acute reminders. So, you know, I couldn't tell you where I was on December 2nd last year, but I can almost always tell you where I was on Thanksgiving or on New Year's Eve or another significant day. Those days sort of stick with us. So we're able to remember, where were we? Who was with us? What did that day feel like? What were we feeling like? You know, we have a lot of those really, really sense memories about those days. And so when we start to look at the holidays coming up or the Thanksgiving that's just passed, we feel almost that more stark and dramatic contrast when someone is missing, when we've had to shift and change our traditions or the places that we go because someone isn't here anymore, because the holidays just don't feel like they used to feel in that kind of nostalgia or yearning for the past that we have. And so that can be really, really, I think, difficult to figure out how do we manage that feeling. Everyone expects me to be in the holiday spirit, and I'm just not, right? I think that there can be a pressure in grief all the time of that feeling if people are expecting me to be over it or to be in a different place, to have been pushed, moved forward in a way that isn't how I'm feeling. So we always have that. But the holidays especially, we've got people who maybe think that we should be putting on a strong face for the kids. People feel like the kids feel like they should be putting a strong face on for adults. And everybody is kind of in that place where we feel like this is a time of year that we're supposed to be, even more than ever, we're supposed to be feeling in some sort of a better mood than we are. And in many ways, the end of the year and this time and passing another holiday or any special day, it's this reminder that another year has passed, and that means another year further from my life with my loved one. And that can be a really, really difficult reminder, especially in a culture that has made us think as time passes that grief is supposed to get easier or that I should be coping better. What we hear a number of people often saying is that sometimes the second year is actually a lot harder than the first year, that the first year was a blur, that I think last year, when we think about, we're still in such an unsure and transitional time with COVID, but last year that was especially true. So I think one of the things that we're hearing from a lot of people is last year felt so disconnected or so different than it ever would, that it feels like my first year facing this time of year, the holiday season. And so I think, a lot of these things are swimming around in people's heads, and many, 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 many more. So as we're thinking about what we're doing here today in terms of continuing bonds is not the single magic solution to getting through the holiday season when you're grieving. There are so many different things that are a part of coping with all these complex feelings of the holidays. But understanding continuing bonds, thinking about continuing bonds, really spending a little bit of time with it can be a really useful way to better understand grief, to better understand it at any time of year. And then I think we can specifically pull it into some things that are helpful with the holiday season and might add a little support to some of those different things that we just talked about and some of those feelings that might come up for people. So to get us to continuing bonds, I have put on the screen the busiest slide in the history of slides, which is a brief history of grief theory. So like I said, continuing bonds is a theory. It comes straight out of a lot of academic research by clinicians who were working with people who were grieving. And in order to really understand and do justice to continuing bonds theory, we kind of have to go back to the beginning and think about what was going on in the world of grief theory before that. And I think in a lot of ways, the history of grief theory helps us to understand our own grief in many ways, and why society has certain beliefs about grief and why we might have internalized some of those beliefs about grief. So really quickly, don't worry, this will not be as boring as it looks. We kind of start with the first person in mental health who in a really concrete way ever tried to talk about grief and give us some ideas about what grief looks like or what we should do to grieve appropriately. And we go all the way back to Freud in the 1920s. And he gave us some ideas that I think make most people cringe now to go back and read them, suggesting that two things that really have influenced the history of how we experience grief. One is that he said we need to express our grief, right? We need to talk about it, and that is the solution. We need to kind of sit down and talk. And it's really interesting that the mental health still really embraces talking as sort of the primary means of processing things that are difficult, even though we know that the research shows us that we don't necessarily have to talk. There's a lot of other things that we can do. We can write, we can create, we can make art, we can make music, we can do so many different things we can read, we can learn, we can listen, we can do so much that's about processing many things in mental health. But we still sort of go back to that Freudian privileging the idea of, go to a support group and we have to talk things out. Talking works really, really well for some people. And for other people, a big piece of learning to grieve is learning to find other ways to be able to kind of process that grief other than just talking. And then the other thing he said that I think makes people a little bit uncomfortable is that we need to detach emotionally from the deceased. So Freud had this idea that we kind of only have a finite amount of energy. And when we put all that energy and love into someone who's died, until we can let go of it, we don't have it to put into the world again and to connect with new people and new things. So Freud's idea was that grieving is learning how to kind of detach in that way. And that will allow us to be able to re-engage with the world. So that really influenced a lot of people for the next 60 years of grief theory, of people who really embraced Freud's idea that part of the work of grieving was that work of figuring out how to let go. And what you start to see is people like Eric Lindemann really built off of Freud, but he was the first one who was put it into a bullet point, right? That thing that became really popular about grief was let's take the most complex human experience we go through and try to narrow it down into a couple of bullet points that will make people feel like it's organized. So Lindemann put forth his grief work hypothesis, where he said there's just these 3 things we need to do, and that's how we'll cope with grief. And he listed those out. And then we had John Bowlby, who started writing in the 60s, though this grief theory came a little bit later, where he talked about the 4 stages of grief, where again, we start to see that people are trying to kind of organize and simplify a universal idea of what grief is going to look like. We get to the 5 stages that are the thing that most people know about grief in the 60s. We move into Rando and Warden, who was very popular in the 80s. And it's not until the 90s that we have the first people in the history of significantly in the history of grief theory who start going, some of these stages and tasks and phases and this idea of kind of moving to the end point of grief doesn't feel like what we're actually seeing with people who are grieving. And we started having some people asking some questions. The dual process model of grief started to say, it feels like this idea that we work on our grief and then we get to the other side of it isn't realistic. They started to say, we think grief actually is something that people continue to cope with throughout their lives, and they're always learning a little bit more about how they're grieving, and they're always learning a little bit more about how they're rebuilding. And really that grief is about oscillating between these times in our life where we may be feeling our grief pretty intensely and spending time with it, and other times where we're rebuilding and just tending to the tasks of everyday living. And we started to see with them a shift and a little bit of a critique that came. So we're going to get to continuing bonds in the 90s. But I think it is important that we take a minute to acknowledge that one of the things that this history of grief theory really did was it sent a lot of messages about how we were supposed to grieve. It gave us these ideas that there were universal stages, that there were tasks that we needed to check off certain boxes in order to be grieving right or grieving well. And many times these stages and tasks and phases, they ended with something that looked or sounded to people, especially in their oversimplified bite-sized versions, which was often what the general public and society was hearing, was something that looked like closure or letting go or moving on. It went back to that kind of Freudian idea that we need to remove our energy from this person who we loved so much who's gone, and then we'll be able to take that energy and put it into the world in new ways. And unfortunately, though we're going to talk a little bit about how in the 90s and then pushing through into the 2000s, that this has shifted in the way we in the field of grief and bereavement and mental health are understanding grief, it still remains so common in pop culture. Everywhere you look, you still see, things about how do we find closure. So many people who are experiencing losses are surrounded by friends, by family members who are kind of giving them that message that if they're still connected to their loved one, they haven't achieved that goal that all of those old grief theories told us was supposed to be the goal of grieving, which was to, find this closure so we could move forward or shift our energy in the ways that Freud used to talk about. So I think one of the things that's so important to understanding our own grief is acknowledging that we are often having the intense experience of loss, all of the thoughts and feelings and existential and spiritual and behavioral things that go along with grieving. But we often have that little voice inside of our heads that has really developed ideas about grief that were sometimes still based on these old models. Things like, I should be further along. There's some timeline. There's some magic, end point that I'm supposed to be working towards and I'm not there. Or feeling like I'm supposed to be at not talking about my loved one so often anymore, because other people are sending me these messages like, oh, why are you still doing that? Or why are you still talking about that? So I think we can gain a little bit of awareness about our own loss in terms of our self-compassion or our self-judgment, and see where it might come from some of these older models. So in the 90s, people started doing a little bit of criticizing these older models and saying this just doesn't seem to be what we're seeing. And even though they've been trained in these models, their work in the community, working with people who were grieving, was really showing them something totally different. And one of the things I think that's really amazing to look at is that a lot of continuing bonds theory started with people who were working with children, adults as well, but I think children played, and working with grieving kids did play a really interesting role in them thinking about how continuing bonds might be a really normal and natural process. And what they found was that kids and adults were often trying to find ways to keep a connection to their loved one who died, but were struggling because of society kind of giving them these messages that they weren't supposed to be doing it. And so they were having a hard time finding outlets for it, and oftentimes hesitating to talk about it. Kids would say that sometimes they were worried about bringing up their loved one who died because they didn't want to upset their parents or their teachers or other people. And parents were saying they didn't want to bring up the person who died because they were worried about upsetting kids or other family members or unsettling people, because we didn't have a sort of culturally normalized idea that we could talk about these things. Research interviews with kids showed that kids would create this set of memories and feelings and actions internally that they often weren't sharing with people in their lives, but that were a huge part of giving them a connection to their, in this case in the research, it was with a parent who died. And they really kept that relationship going in all of these different ways over time. And what they found was that relationship that they created with their parent who had died was not static, right? It evolved and it changed with time. And it, again, the continuing bonds group, when they were kind of looking through their research, one of the things that was so interesting is they were working with many different groups. So you had the theorists who were working with kids, but then you had people who were working with widows, with bereaved parents, with bereaved college students. So it was really a wide range of people. And what they were finding is that it was pretty consistent across all of these different groups. There was certainly a little bit of variation for various reasons. But what they found was that during this period of time that people, while they were grieving, were often doing these things internally, but in this, bereaved parents would say that they rarely talked about it for fear that others would think they were crazy. Widows described this idea that they would often go back to memories and connections of their partner who died in the most difficult moments. So if they were going through something hard or stressful or overwhelming, or something else difficult happened in their lives, they would often then go back to what they described as a safe haven, sort of a place where they would think about their partner who died and what would their partner say to support them, or try to remember kind of how they felt when they used to maybe get a sense of comfort or confidence from their partner. And again, this felt at the time a little bit counterintuitive. People thought, wow, when somebody's going through something really terrible, it seems strange that they would go back to remembering this other really terrible thing that happened, that they lost someone who was incredibly important to them. But when we start to look at this model, it makes a lot of sense, right? That actually what we were finding is that attachment that to the person who died, that for so long was viewed as problematic and pathological in the history of grief theory, wasn't necessarily problematic or pathological at all. It was really a source of comfort. And it was something that people were doing normally and naturally. They just weren't being able to find that external validation for it. And so they were keeping a lot of that inside. So the kind of, if we want to look at just from the very academic perspective of what was continuing bonds theory doing, it was really this idea of overturning the idea that disengaging is a goal of grief. And out of their book in 96, the view of grief most accepted in this, oh, sorry for that typo, this century holds that for successful mourning to take place, the mourner must disengage with the deceased and let go of the past. To experience a continued bond with the deceased in the present has been thought to be symptomatic of pathological problems. A continued attachment to the deceased was called unresolved grief. And they went on to say that in this book, rather than judging dependence as undesirable, we accept the way people feel themselves to be involved in each other's lives. In the mode of grief that we propose, interdependence is sustained even in the absence of one of the parties. The data presented by the contributors of this book suggest that the bereaved remained involved and connected to the deceased, and that the bereaved actively construct inner representations of the deceased that is part of the normal grieving process. This book challenges the idea that the purpose of grief is to sever the bond with the deceased in order for the survivor to be free and make new attachments that construct a new identity. So this is really the core of something that in so many ways, for so many grievers, I think people are like, obviously, did we really need a theory to say that this was, that this is how we should be looking at grief? But we did, right? We spent the entire century telling people that it was wrong to be keeping connections with their loved ones. And to only be about 20 years outside of that means we haven't had a lot of time to undo some of that thinking about the way that we are supposed to grieve. So, they went on to say that remaining connected seemed to facilitate both children and adults' ability to cope with the loss and the accompanying changes in their lives. These connections provided solace, comfort, and support, and they eased the transition from the past to the future. And I think for anyone who's worked in grief and for anyone who has maybe gone through a loss and considered going to get any sort of support for that grief, one of the things that you have maybe thought or maybe heard someone say at some point is this idea that they come in thinking what they're supposed to be doing is moving on and letting go, and they don't want to move on or let go. And we hear this from people so often, right? Why would I want to move on from someone who I loved so much? And to think that that's still an idea that people will believe about what it means to get support for their grief. And continuing bonds offers a framework that when so many grievers hear it, when people certainly come in to work with us, whether it's in a group or a workshop or individually for counseling, I think when we frame things in the idea that those connections, if that's something that is normally and naturally happening, is something that is meaningful and part of grieving, is figuring out how we keep connections over time, that there is a real relief that people feel that allows them to realize that really the process of grieving is about learning how to have a relationship with a person who's died and bring that person's memory with you into the future. So under this model, if we're thinking a little bit about what does continuing bonds mean, we think that, okay, we saw that kids and adults, they would think about these memories or sometimes objects or representations. If we look at that on the surface, it might be easy to say, if we apply that to the holidays, does that just mean we try to keep things the same and connect and hold on to as many of those memories and bonds and traditions as we can? And the short answer to this is no. We can't do this, right? As much as we would love to keep all of those things and traditions and places, we know that for many reasons we can't do that. But the other piece about that is that sometimes holding on that tightly to those places and traditions and things actually does feel like an intensified reminder that things have changed. We can't pretend that everything is exactly the same by trying to recreate the same holiday season of the past and do that without our loved ones. That sometimes that actually within the flexing and thinking about what continuing bonds means for that is where people can find some of the more comforting ways to cope during the holiday season. So part of that is remembering that in the continuing bonds research, and part of the theory and what we understand about continuing bonds, is the people who found continuing bonds the most helpful when they were grieving. In a lot of this research, the bonds that they created and connected, they changed and evolved with time, just as the person grieving changed and evolved with time. So it wasn't that they would create one tradition or one particular memory and hold on to that so tightly that they would always do that for the rest of their lives, go to that same place, or always eat that same exact meal. It would often be that year after year, there would be things that were slowly shifting and changing. This makes a lot of sense with kids, especially because if I lost my parent when I was 7, the thing that felt like an important connection to me and my 7-year-old brain about my connection to my parent or to my sibling might start to feel really different when I'm 11. And I suddenly understand the world a little bit differently. And the things that were important to me when I was 7 aren't as important to me. And so now the things that are important to me about my memories, about my parent or my sibling, or about wanting to learn new things that I didn't even know when I was 7 to ask about, that now that I can ask about when I'm 11, those new things become important. So now I might learn something brand new, and that feels really meaningful. And when I'm 18 and getting ready to go off to college, I might want to learn all about my parent if they had gone to college, and learn about all of these new things. And I might decide to do certain things at college that I've just now learned are something that my parent did, or something that a class that they loved. So these bonds they don't have to be static or stagnant. And in fact, what the research found was those who created continued bonds that were really static, where they had a hard time flexing these bonds, where they weren't able to maybe think about how they could change with time, but instead got really attached to kind of only one bond, or just didn't allow it the space to grow as they grew. Those people actually didn't find as much comfort with the bonds. In fact, sometimes the bonds got to be a little bit difficult or distressing because it felt like they were only in the past, rather than thinking of the bond as something that could be continuing to grow and change along with the person. And one of the things that the writers of the continuing bonds theory books, which now there's another one that just came out a couple of years ago, one of the things that they were really careful to say is that continuing bonds, as amazing as it is, as common as it is for people who are grieving to develop bonds, they're quick to say that it's not prescriptive. They're not trying to say when you're grieving, you should be creating a continued bond. They didn't want to fall into the same trap of some of those old grief theories of saying, okay, this is the check box you have to check, is to create a continued bond. Instead, they said, for some people, maybe most people, that creating continued bonds is a really normal, natural thing that evolves. And what we should be doing is supporting that bond if it's happening normally and naturally. We shouldn't be prescribing it. We shouldn't tell people this is what they have to do. Sometimes they found that relationships were really complicated, right? If there was a history of abuse or other issues in a relationship, that might not be a relationship that somebody wants to continue bonds. As this says here, sometimes when kids struggled with allowing their bond to evolve and it was very static, that could be hard for kids if they weren't kind of able to see how that bond could grow with them as they grew. Sometimes bonds have negative consequences. So sometimes, oftentimes we think of the really lovely ways that we stay connected to our loved ones through memories or reminders, or making the food that they loved to cook, or using expressions that they used to use. But sometimes people would find bonds that weren't necessarily the healthiest. I worked with a client once, and his dad was really into partying and using lots of substances. And at the time, my client was really young when his dad died. And so he didn't even really fully understand it. But as he grew up, he heard lots of stories about that. So when he got to the age in high school that he could do all of that partying that he knew his dad did, he did a lot of that partying that his dad did, and ended up in a place where he was using substances in a way that were not healthy, that weren't good for his coping, but that had started in this place of kind of, this is a continued bond. This is a way I can do something I knew that my dad used to do and maybe feel a connection with him. So there are times where we need to be careful with what kind of bonds we're picking up. And then the other thing that the research shows, and that we know ourselves, is that for some people, early on especially, continued connections can feel more painful than they do comforting. And the reality of continuing bonds is there's always a little bit of both, right? When we're continuing our connection with a person, many times we're thinking about them and remembering them in a way that brings both comfort and that sadness that they're gone. But sometimes, especially early on, it can be intense and overwhelming in a way where maybe if we pull out photos, we just feel like we can't even look at them because it's only causing distress. It's not causing any comfort. Or you walk into the store at the holiday season and their favorite holiday song comes on the radio, and you feel like you have to leave the store because it's so intensely overwhelming that you kind of can't take a moment to even appreciate any of that. All it is pain. And early on, what a lot of the research shows us is that's really, really normal, is that it can be too intense early on sometimes to create those continued bonds. The important thing to remember is that just because it is too painful early on doesn't mean that it will be too painful forever. So what certain people will sometimes do is they might, based on early on in their loss, suddenly believe that something is too much or too overwhelming for them to ever do again. So they go maybe back to their favorite holiday service at somewhere, or their favorite holiday event in their town. And the first year that going back without their loved one is so overwhelming that they can't stay and they leave. And it can be really easy then to make up a story where we say, like, that's it. I can never go back to that again. I'm always going to feel that much pain with that much intensity that I'll never be able to go back and find any of the comforting memories or any of, the joy that might be associated with that. And what we know is, of course, that with time and with support and doing it kind of in the right way, that absolutely many people are able to get back to a point where they're able to kind of do that. Really quickly, because I want us to have a little bit of time for people to share some of the things that they've done to continue bonds and also to think about the holiday season. I just want to point out this one other important piece of thinking about continued bonds, which is the term gets used as though it's just kind of one big umbrella term. But as more and more research started coming out about continued bonds, and we started to think about it in new and more different and nuanced ways, some people started saying, I don't know, continued bonds don't always seem to be helpful or healthy for some people. For example, if I haven't been able to part with any of my husband's clothing, or if my child is so distressed about the idea that we're gonna sell her dad's car that we can't get past that and she can't function, right? That could, on the one hand, be called a continued bond, but on the other hand, it feels like it's making it harder for people to move forward or be flexible, or it kind of might be too much. And this was a space where they started to get a little bit more nuanced and say, early on in grief, the physical bonds are what oftentimes to people feel the most important. it's all of their loved ones' belongings, right? You don't want to part with anything. You want to keep all their clothes. You can't imagine that you're going to get rid of like even a scrap of paper that has their handwriting on it, because you'll never get to have any more of that handwriting again. And so there can be that feeling of wanting to find closeness from what they call physical proximity, or sometimes they call it externalized bonds, right? Like those are the things that feel really, really, really meaningful. And what the research found with time is that though early on that was incredibly wonderful and natural, and we should never judge keeping all of that stuff in the beginning, because sometimes that's really important and meaningful, that they found that as time passed, if people remained really focused on only on those physical externalized bonds as a way to feel close, and weren't able to kind of shift their bonds to be more internalized, to be more about their memories of the person, to start thinking of those objects as not meaningful simply because their loved one at some point touched it, but maybe the only objects that are really so meaningful that we need to keep them are the ones that bring up a specific memory about my loved one, or that represent something about who they were in the world. The object, what makes that object meaningful is part of what it does to remind me about that person who's gone. So that's this shift that can happen where we become a little bit more internal in thinking about our continued bond. And that bond goes from being exclusively physical to being more about thinking about what are our psychological and internal connections. And what they found was that when people struggled to integrate grief, a lot of times they were struggling to create internalized bonds, and they were really focused just on those externalized bonds. So a little bit of thinking about this is not to say, okay, externalized physical bonds are bad, right? Not at all. There's so many wonderful externalized bonds that might be anything from just to drinking out of a loved one's coffee cup every day, to just a meaningful object, or going back to a restaurant or a place you used to go to, or things you used to do. But the issue is thinking about, and especially if we think about the holiday season too, knowing that we need a combination of these things, and we need to often recognize this connection between internalized and externalized. Because the reality is externalized bonds, right? They can be temporary. If I'm so attached to the restaurant that I used to go to with my dad, I can't control if that restaurant closes down, right? I can't control that externalized thing. If I am so attached to certain physical objects, and all of a sudden my house floods and I've lost a bunch of those things, right? I feel like I have no control over those things, and it can be a deep, deep secondary loss. And these are really, really hard, and they can bring up a lot of insecurity when it feels like these are my only connections. When we also have some of these internalized ones, we realize that these are with me no matter where I go, right? Even if I have to sell my house and move to a different town, even if that restaurant closes, my memories that are there, those connections of the values that are connected to my loved one, those are the things that stay with me. Those are the things that can evolve, that can grow, that can change, that can happen anywhere. So as we go into the holiday season, I'm going to come back to this if we have time, but I'm going to skip it for now. As we go into the holiday season, one of the things that's really important for us to do is to think about both the continued bonds in the internalized and externalized sense. And one thing that's tough is that traditions are often really physical, externalized things. There are places we go, there are songs, that we sing, there are things that sometimes are very, very tangible. And some of those things are things that are easy for us to continue with and to keep the same. And some of them are things that might have to flex a little bit. So when we think about tradition at this time of year, or any time of year that's important to a family, one of the things that can be important is to just really be able acknowledge that certain things might be physical, but what is behind that physicality that's so important, right? Is it something that is about home or family, or is it about my loved one maybe had certain values like generosity, or maybe it's something that represents family, or it's something that represents kind of different things that we associate. Do we feel a warmth that just goes with certain places or certain things? And even if even if we're going to keep a lot of these physical continued bonds and traditions at the holiday, it can be a good reminder and a good way when we talk about those things, especially with kids, to be able to talk about them as sort of an object or a tradition itself, but also connect it to that value. Because if for some reason, next year we're not able to go to grandma's house for the holiday for any number of reasons, we're able to call back and we're able to say, oh, but the reason that we love grandma's house so much is because it's warm and it felt like home and there was family there. And like, those were all of the things that we loved. And even though we're not going to be able to be at grandma's house this year, like, what are we going to do in whatever space that we're in to make sure that it feels like home and it feels like warm and comfort and family? How can we create those values here? And the way we do it might look a little different. The way that it flexes might be something that's new to us in some ways, but that's still connected at that core with our bond to grandma, because we're now trying to create in whatever space we're in the same thing that grandma always created for us at her house. So we can kind of have a balance here where we're doing a little bit of the internal and a little external, and it can help both kids and adults for us to have that flexibility over time, to know that some things are going to change and some things are going to flex, and some things are, maybe we've had that same star on the top of the Christmas tree, or we've had that same centerpiece on the Thanksgiving table for the last 5 generations, and that's amazing. But that we still have an idea of what it represents if, unfortunately, it breaks next year and we have to think about how to recreate and do something a little different. So the last piece, and before we do a couple tangible things, I think, is just, that we want to think about the idea that with all of these, we want to think about them as both physical bonds, but also psychological bonds, thinking about both pieces. We want to think about the fact that things can evolve and change and never get so attached to any particular tradition that we're not able to think about how we will carry it with us, even if we have to flex it in the future. And that we recognize that continuing bonds at the holidays and any time of year, that bittersweet is really the name of the game here. We're not trying to say this is going to be all about comforting feelings at the holidays. It's about saying the holidays are going to be hard, right? And one of the things that we can do is we can think about some ways to honor and remember the people who we love and we miss. And that's going to be a little bit sad and a little bit comforting all at the same time. And that's okay. That in order to get those good comforting feelings that we're going to have by sharing those memories or those traditions, that there's going to be a little bit of sad that might come with it too. And that's okay, because we feel all the feelings. And this is where I would love, I've been talking so much, everyone. Thank you for hanging in, but I would love to hear a little bit as we think about continued bonds and connections. I have a couple of kind of categories and idea of things where we can have ideas. But if anybody does things already where you kind of continue bonds and connections in any of these areas, I would love for people to share any suggestions that they have. One, I think that certainly around the holiday season, but all year, is very popular, is food and recipes. On the What's Your Grief website, we actually have a section that is in the Share Your Grief section, that's Share Your Grief Recipe. And so we invite people all the time to share food and recipes that were connected to their loved ones. And also sometimes to use the holidays as a time of year that even if it's not about the memory of a loved one and what they used to cook, to teach another generation of the family maybe something that you cook that is a way that you're going to pass down that tradition. You know, maybe make sure that if anything were to happen, that somebody knows how to make your famous apple pie. So to be able to kind of do that. One of the other things I love that we know some people, especially if they're struggling with the holiday season and maybe really not in this spirit at all, one tradition I have heard that, or one like kind of new tradition I've heard from people is that they've scrapped the whole holiday meal completely, the traditional holiday meal, and instead they've just had a meal of all of their loved ones' favorite foods. Which may not have been foods that went together at all, right? But they just decided that they would have tacos and Oreo cookies and any other food that their loved one loved. And it was a way to sort of still mark the holiday, but also sort of acknowledge their grief and their connection to someone. I often tell a story about how I, one year, tried to make all my grandmother's holiday cookies. She used to make all of these holiday cookies. And I got so emotional and so overwhelmed. The whole thing was like a complete fail. I did not end up making the holiday cookies, but I did then take all of her recipe cards that had her beautiful handwriting on them, and I had them blown up and framed, and they're now on my kitchen wall as a really lovely little connection to her, even though the cookies themselves didn't turn out. So I think sometimes with all this, you have to have flexibility because sometimes your recipe is not going to come out nearly as well as your loved ones did. This time of year, another thing that we know a lot of people will do is at their holiday event, have some sort of memorial jar or basket or stocking. If your loved one, if you are a family that hangs stockings, it can be really hard the first year of pulling that box of holiday decorations out and having your loved one's stocking there and just not knowing what to do with it. So one thing that can be nice is to hang that stocking anyway, or to create a basket or a jar or somewhere in the house, and leave out a pen and paper and invite people to either on the holiday itself, or you can do it all through the holiday season, to write down their favorite memories or write down messages or thoughts or things they wish they could tell the person who's gone, and then spend some time either individually or as a family on at a certain time of the holiday to just read those memories together, or just let people, it doesn't have to be organized if that's not a family culture, to just pull things out at different times. And you can do this in different settings too. Obviously, we've even absolutely seen workplaces do this, schools do this, other places do this as a way to have one collection area of being able to kind of create some of these things. One of the other activities that we love at the holidays that can be done in a lot of settings is we've seen this done as ornaments, we've seen it done as jars, we've seen it done in different ways with actually making lots of things. So I think you can kind of translate the idea for any number of things. But with this, when we did it here as an ornament, we had all different colors of ribbon. And we had the kids who were participating label all of the different feelings that were coming up around thinking about the holiday without their loved one. And so, we had a range of different feelings that kids were feeling. And then we had these little stars and snowflakes that were labeled as memories. So kids went around and they pulled all the different things they were feeling. And some of the kids had all of one color in theirs, and some of them had mixtures of all the different things. And then they went around, and the kids who wanted to had the chance to, with each memory they put in, to share the memory with the family or with the group or with anybody before they put it in, or they can do it privately if they don't want to have to share. But in the end, it becomes, I think, something that hopefully, again, sort of symbolizes a little bit about the complexity of the holidays, but also that continued bond that we have, those feelings and those memories that keep us connected to loved ones. And I'm curious if anybody has any other suggestions around these. I know I asked specifically about food, but if you have any around other ways of kind of either creating decorations that feel like they're connected with continued bonds, or creating ways for people to share memories. This one, obviously, I shared already, and this one is another way of sharing memories that we really love. So this is a picture of one that was done with an actual old school physical photo album, but now we've had some people show us that they actually did it by having, using Snapfish or one of the books that you can have printed. But the idea of it is to actually leave lots and lots of white space. So to maybe put a picture on one side and really create albums that have a lot of white space. And so when family are gathered, or when people are coming together in any way, to invite people who were there, usually this is about events or places or times, write their own memories of that specific day. So to share their particular memory. And what we've found with, certainly when I've done this in my family, and when we've had many other people do this over the years, is just that many times families will find that, wow, like everybody's memories of one particular vacation were so different. And some people remembered one really specific weird thing that happened, and somebody else remembered something else very specific. But that oftentimes it's an opportunity where people can share memories of a loved one who is gone, that other people may have never heard or have forgotten completely. And for kids, this can be so valuable, because we know that kids will so often talk about wishing that they had more memories of their loved one who was gone, especially kids who are younger. So this can be a great way for even kids who never got to meet certain family members to be able to feel that connection to certain family members, and to be able to kind of share their own memories as well of certain things from the past. If it's around any holiday where there's gift giving, and I would say this is true for birthdays as well, even though we're talking a lot about winter holidays and maybe thinking about things like Hanukkah and Christmas. At birthdays or anniversaries, another thing that we find a lot of people sometimes taking comfort in is still getting the gift that you would have bought for your loved one. If you're in a store and see something that they would have loved, that you still buy that gift anyway. And then think about what you want to do with it. Some people decide that they want to donate that gift, and that feels significant every year. And this can be something with kids that can be really nice to do, to be able to say, let's go out and buy the gift that we would have bought for dad, and then we'll take it and we'll donate it to a shelter or somewhere else that feels important. Some people decide to get the gift and then give it to someone else, which can also be a really nice thing to do with kids, to kind of pick it out and say, we wish that we could give it to dad, but we can't give it to dad. He's not here. So who do we want to give it to instead? And maybe it's somebody else in the family, maybe it's one of dad's friends, maybe it's somebody completely random, maybe it's one of their friends. But we kind of create a space to do that and be able to talk about why that felt important, what kind of continued bond that we keep up by allowing our connection to what dad would have wanted to kind of continue in the world in some way. And I'm curious if anybody has any others that they've done around this. If you celebrate a gift giving holiday, I would please welcome anybody in the chat if you have any other thoughts. And certainly, obviously, there's some of the much more traditional things that people will do around the holidays, of making conscious and deliberate efforts when we talk about continued bonds. About really saying that part of what can be comforting in families is when we create this culture where it's okay to talk about our bonds, and where that's really part of our family, is thinking about those traditions from the past and thinking about how we do that together, and that can really be an important part of the holiday. And while also I'll go back to that one slide I skipped, and then we'll wrap up here. While also recognizing that individual personal things, private rituals are really meaningful for us too. So this doesn't have to be that all of the holiday traditions and all of the holiday continued bonds and things we do have to be as a family. Sometimes what one family member wants is not what another family member wants. You might not have family members who are looking to do some of these more explicit continued bonds things. So sometimes it's about thinking about what your little private rituals will be. And sometimes with kids, it's so important for kids to just normalize that they probably have these little private individual things that they're doing. And if they want to share those around the holiday and as part of the holiday, or they want to share it with the family, they can. But if that's something that they want to keep private and individual, that's okay too. And that a lot of grief rituals that are meaningful at the holidays and year round are really private things as well. So I know that I have just edged us to the very end. So I apologize that I already have made us 2 minutes over, but I would be happy to answer questions people have, or if there's anything, whether it's about continued bonds or just about the holidays in general. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I love what people are sharing in the chat. I think being able to always make mincemeat tarts, which my grandmother also made, and she was English. And I think being able to do that and carry that on as a tradition is such a meaningful bond. And again, I think one of the things with food is that food can be meaningful and valuable in and of itself. But also that shared time together, the fact that it's a memory with family, being able to then carry that on can be incredibly meaningful. And yeah, food-based. My family is very food-based as well. So I don't know if anyone else has any other suggestions or thoughts, questions, but happy to take anything else before we wrap up, or otherwise we can wrap up.
Yeah, feel free to use that chat, everyone. I mean, I just think there were so many beautiful and good ideas, practical things that people can do. I love those ornaments, the photo albums, the idea of, buying a gift and maybe donating it or giving it to someone else. Just, really, I mean, practical things that people can do. But I think also that focus on the internal side, because I think it can be easier, I think, to look at those external things, objects, stuff, but what can we do to carry that with us inside that can adapt and grow and flex with us for all of our lives? I mean, I think that's the trick for many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we model that, for kids, and when we just start talking about it more, talk about it for that reason, right? It's one thing to say, oh, grandma always used to make this mincemeat pie, but it's another thing to say, oh, part of my memory of feeling close with her and like family was cooking together, and that was sort of part of that. I think we help kids to see, and we remind ourselves that it's not just about the physical things, it's what those things represent, and that we carry those on in the world in so many different ways. And so I think that's such an important part of how we can embody continued bonds at the holidays.
Absolutely. I agree. And also appreciate, just normalizing this, all of this, talking about it, sharing the stories, especially at Good Grief. We work primarily with families, kids, hearing those stories, knowing that what they're feeling and doing is, normal and good and healthy, I think are so important. Oh, thank you. Yes, I see you put your email in there. Yeah. I'm also going to pop a few things in the chat before we get going. So we do have a few more webinars coming up. So if you like this, you'll probably like what we have coming up as well. Next month, we have a webinar about growing up and grieving at work. So grief at work. February, we have a Good Grief Schools webinar coming up. And I also popped the survey. So if you liked what you saw, let us know if there's something you would like us to see or do in the future. We also want to hear about that and how we can make this really useful for you all. But thank you, everyone. A deep appreciation for those of you who are watching live. appreciation for those of you who are watching this recorded later. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was so wonderful to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, and good night.